Poor rancher. Risked life for two Apache sisters. Their chief's decision changed his fate. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The frost-rimmed horizon was the only thing I had to measure my life against these past 3 years. Every sunrise was a promise of more wind, more bone-deep cold, and more struggle on this failing scrap of land I called the Vance Ranch. But today, the blood on the snow was not the usual crimson stain of a dying calf or a butchered deer. It was mountain lion blood, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't my own. I stood panting, the cruel January wind biting at the gaping wounds in my chest, wounds that sliced through my heavy woolen coat and the worn flannel shirt beneath. My makeshift spear, a splintered gatepost with a rusty curved spike meant for mending wire, lay twisted and useless beside the massive tawny corpse of the beast. Its golden eyes, now filmed over with death, stared blankly up at the colorless iron-gray sky. The animal's rank, coppery scent mingled with the clean, metallic tang of my own blood seeping onto the frozen ground. I was still half mad with adrenaline, my whole body shaking so violently I thought my ribs might rattle loose. The roar of the fight was still ringing in my ears, drowning out the whistle of the wind that tore across the high plains. Behind me, 2 figures stood perfectly still. 2 Apache women wrapped tightly in thick tanned hides against the fierce cold were not screaming. They were not running. They were simply watching me with an unnerving intensity, as if I were a predictable weather pattern they had been observing all their lives. I looked down at the cat, then at my hands. My knuckles were pulped raw meat bleeding into the snow. The struggle had been desperate, primal, and utterly silent, save for the snarls and the ragged sounds of my own breathing. Any sane man would have retreated. Any smart man would have let the cat have its way. But I couldn't just stand there and watch, not with the frantic, terrified look in the eyes of the younger woman, her breath steaming white in the Arctic air trapped against a jagged outcropping of black rock. The older sister, Kiana, I would later learn, stepped forward. Her face was composed, carved from granite by years of hardship, but her eyes, deep dark pools in the frigid light, held a penetrating warmth. She spoke a string of clipped guttural words in Apache to the younger one. The younger Liseli nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then Kiana looked at me, her gaze lingering on the 3 deep gashes across my chest, the lines of blood blooming darkly on the pale fabric of my coat. "The chief has been waiting for you, Elias Vance." The words hit me harder than the mountain lion's claws. They were spoken in clear, measured English, yet they sounded like thunder rolling across the winter plains. Waiting for me, I felt the last of the adrenaline burn off, leaving me hollowed out and suddenly terrified. I don't know any, Chief. I've never spoken to your people before." My voice was a raw croak, tasting of copper and fear. The wind shifted, swirling a fresh dusting of snow over the dead predator. Liseli, the younger woman, finally moved. She knelt beside the cat, not in fear, but with a focused detachment. She reached beneath the massive body and pulled something small and pale from the bloodied snow, a piece of bone intricately carved. It was stained crimson from the cat's blood, and its surface was etched with symbols I didn't recognize. "This was under the cat," she corrected herself, her tone carrying an unnerving certainty. Her English was flawless, but her voice was low, musical, completely at odds with the brutal scene. It was carrying a message. I squinted, trying to make sense of the impossibility. A mountain lion didn't carry messages. Animals didn't deliver carved bones. Yet there it was, evidence that this day was not a random act of nature, but something far more complicated. Kiana came closer, and her fingers, stiff from the cold but surprisingly gentle, touched my torn coat and traced the 3 parallel claw marks on my chest. I winced. The cold air had kept the pain manageable until now, but her touch brought the searing agony back to life. 3 cuts, she murmured, her eyes distant as if reciting something learned long ago. Just like the prophecy said. Prophecy, I wanted to laugh, a sharp, desperate sound, but the pain held it captive in my throat. I had stumbled into a situation that felt enormous, ancient, and terrifyingly premeditated. "We need to stop that bleeding," Kiana said, her voice immediately dropping from mystic to pragmatic. She moved with the practiced economy of a healer. Liseli stood up, clutching the bone. "It must have dropped when she fell," she conceded, glancing at her sister. "That's what makes sense to your mind, at least, rancher. Someone dropped this here recently," Liseli continued, ignoring my confusion. She turned the bone, slowly inspecting the carved symbols. "These markings, they are territorial markers. Someone is claiming this land." Kiana produced a pouch from the belt of her thick bison hide coat, pulling out clean strips of treated leather. "You saved our lives," she said simply. her dark eyes meeting mine. We were gathering winter herbs beneath the rocks when she attacked. You didn't have to risk yourself for strangers in this cold. The pain was a white-hot knife as she began cleaning the wounds with something acrid and stinging. I sucked air through my teeth, couldn't just stand there and watch. I muttered the obvious truth of it echoing hollowly in the vast silence. Most would have, Kiana replied, her breath misting between us. That is precisely why Chief Chayton values men like you. Your chief doesn't know me, I insisted, confusion mixing with a sudden dull anger. I hated being talked about as if I were some curiosity under a microscope. The sisters exchanged a quick knowing look. Laselli tucked the bone deep into her own coat pocket and stepped nearer her presence, a sudden intense heat despite the cold. He knows about you, Elias Vance. Word travels fast in this cold about the white man trying to make something of that dried-up snow-covered land to the south. How did they know my name? I had lived here alone for 3 brutal years, battling the cold, the drought, and the solitude. I barely talked to the few white men left, let alone the Apache families who kept to themselves. The cold winter hit everyone hard, Kiana explained as she worked her movements precise and quick. Your white neighbors gave up, packed their miserable wagons, and left before the first hard snow fell. But you stayed. You kept working land that everyone, even our people, said was worthless. Laselli nodded in agreement, her gaze distant, fixed on the skeletal trees lining the frozen creek. Chief Chayton respects that kind of persistence, Elias, especially when it's born from a refusal to be broken. What would your chief want with a failed rancher? The question left my mouth heavy with the bitter weight of 3 years of disappointment. I had watched my dreams slowly freeze and shatter under the relentless, unforgiving sky. Failure was etched into every collapsing fence post and every hungry, shivering cow I owned. Kiana finished bandaging my chest, tying the knot with a swift final motion, and stepped back. Who says you failed? Before I could muster a retort, a defense of my own self-diagnosis, Laselli pointed toward the west. Someone's coming, and they ride fast through this weather. In the distance, a small group of riders was approaching, their figures dark against the white, windswept expanse. Even from this range, I could see the disciplined, purposeful way they rode, bundled in heavy furs and leather. As they drew closer, I counted 6 men on horseback, their long black hair escaping their winter headbands, their faces stoic and serious. They were Apache warriors. My gut seized up tight, colder than the January air. I had just killed a mountain lion on what was certainly Apache hunting ground, maybe even sacred ground. I might have interfered with their hunt, or violated some ancient territorial boundary. Will there be trouble? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Laselli actually smiled, a quick, almost startled flash of white teeth against her dark skin. It was the first time she had shown anything other than detached focus since the attack. That depends entirely on how you answer their questions, Elias Vance. The riders were close enough now that I could see the lead man clearly. He sat straight and tall in his saddle, unmoved by the biting wind. His dark eyes, sharp as flint, fixed instantly on the scene, the dead cat, the 2 relieved sisters, and the bloodied, ragged white man standing in the middle of the desolation. Remember, Kiana said softly, adjusting the collar of her heavy coat against the swirling snow. Answer honestly. Chief Chayton values truth above all else. But as the group surrounded us, I realized I didn't know what questions they would ask, or whether my honest answers would be enough to keep me alive in this cold, hostile territory. The lead rider dismounted with the fluid, silent grace of a hunter. His boots barely compressed the dusting of fresh snow. He stood nearly a head taller than my 6 feet, with broad, powerful shoulders hidden beneath layers of fur. His face was weathered, handsome, and hard, with scars near his jawline that spoke of countless battles fought and survived. But it was his eyes that held my attention, intelligent, commanding, and currently studying every torn thread of my coat. Kiana. Laselli. His voice carried a relief that was quickly masked by authority. This man saved us, Tarek, Kiana said, using a title of respect, I guessed. The cat had Laselli cornered against the rocks. The man Tarek circled the dead mountain lion, slowly examining the wounds. The 3 deep, precise punctures in the cat's neck where my spike had found its desperate mark were visible even through the matted fur. Claw marks scored the frozen dirt, telling the story of the struggle, and blood spatters stained the undisturbed white snow. You killed this alone, Tarek asked, his dark gaze finally locking onto mine. The cold in his eyes was deeper than the winter itself. Yes, I replied, meeting his gaze despite the exhaustion and the fear that now ran cold in my veins. With what weapon? I gestured weakly to the bent, ruined piece of wood lying in the snow nearby. That, and my hands when the post broke. One of the other riders whispered something sharp and incredulous in Apache. Tarek silenced him instantly with a raised gloved hand. "Show me your hands." The command was absolute. I extended my arms. My knuckles were split and swollen, already turning purple with the cold. The palms were torn open from gripping the rough, frozen wood. Deep, angry scratches covered my forearms where the cat's claws had raked across my skin during the final struggle. Tarek examined them carefully, turning my hands over gently, then looked at the dead animal again. Mountain lions do not usually attack in such a wide-open place in daylight, especially not in this deep cold, he observed, unless they are desperate or defending territory. Lascelles pulled the carved bone from her pocket. The symbols caught the weak winter light. "We found this beneath her body." Tarek took the bone, turning the ancient piece over and over in his massive fingers. His expression darkened and the cold in his eyes seemed to deepen into ice. "These markings are not Apache." "Then who?" Kiana asked, her voice strained. "Cattlemen from the east," Tarek said grimly, his gaze sweeping over the ravaged landscape. "They have been pushing closer to our borders for months, even through the snow. This bone is a land claim marker." A fresh chill ran down my spine, unrelated to the weather. I knew the kind of men Tarek was describing. Ruthless, rapacious land grabbers who saw this vast, unforgiving territory as free for the taking. They used intimidation, violence, and the brutal winter itself to clear out anyone they considered an obstacle, be they white ranchers or Apache families. The cat was not hunting Tarek, continued his voice low, with sudden chilling certainty. She was protecting her cubs. Someone drove her from her den, forced her into unfamiliar territory where she became desperate. The disparate pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my freezing mind. I had heard the whisper stories about cattlemen intentionally driving predators toward Apache settlements, hoping the resulting conflicts would provide a pretext for military intervention. "You said the chief knows about me," I said, choosing my words with careful precision, the fear now replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. "What exactly does he know?" Tarek studied me for a long, silent moment, the swirling snow making his face indistinct. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and heavy like the coming dusk. "He knows you have refused 3 offers, each one escalating, each one a thinly veiled threat to sell your land to the very cattlemen who likely ordered." This marker dropped, Tarek stated. "He knows you have shared water from your well with our families during the summer drought, even when your own cattle were dying of thirst and your reservoir was only ice and mud." I was stunned into silence. I had never thought anyone noticed those small, desperate gestures. Certainly not the chief of the tribe. "He also knows," Tarek added, mounting his horse with swift efficiency, "that you are running out of time, Elias Vance." "What do you mean?" "The cattlemen who want your land are not the type to accept no for an answer, especially not in this economy." Tarek replied, his tone hard as iron. "When they cannot buy what they want, they find other ways to take it. Ways that look like an unfortunate accident in the bitter cold." Kiana stepped forward, the worry in her eyes clouding her composure. "That is why we were really here today, Elias. Not just gathering frost-hardened medicinal plants. We were watching for signs of trouble." "Watching my land?" I asked. "Protecting it," Lascelles corrected, her hand resting instinctively on the pocket where the carved bone lay hidden. "Our chief sent us to keep a quiet eye on things while he decided what to do about you." "Do about me?" I felt a profound disorientation. "Do what about me?" Tarek looked down from his saddle, his breath clouding his serious face. "Chief Chayton has been watching you for months through the worst of the summer heat, and now this winter freeze, trying to determine what kind of man you really are. Today you gave him his answer, Elias Vance." The group began to move, Kiana and Lascelles mounting the spare horses 2 of the riders had led. They waited patiently, watching me. "Are you coming, Elias?" Tarek asked. "Where to meet the chief? He has been waiting to speak with you since the first blizzard." I looked back toward my small ranch, in the distance, a low, squat shadow against the vast white expanse. I saw the ruins of my solitary, failing life. I looked at the dead mountain lion, and the tiny, blood-stained bone that represented a threat I was only now beginning to grasp. "What if I say no?" Tarek's expression grew serious, his face etched with a profound sense of warning. "Then you ride back to your ranch alone, Elias. And whatever happens next happens without our protection. This cold is a cruel master, and the cattlemen are crueler." The choice was clear, cold, and absolute. The consequences, however, were still unknown. Chief Chayton wanted to meet the man who had risked everything, including the very warmth of his body in this killer cold, to save 2 Apache sisters. The question was whether that meeting would seal my fate, or be the beginning of a life entirely different from the one I had known. I mounted the spare horse they offered me, wincing as the movement pulled savagely at my bandaged chest. The animal was strong and well-trained, its thick winter coat a sign of careful keeping, and it responded to my clumsy touch with calm obedience. As we rode away from the terrible scene, leaving the dead cat to the scavengers, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was abandoning not just my property but the entire history of who I had been. The journey was a masterclass in hidden passage. The Apache settlement lay nestled deep in a valley, protected by colossal red rock formations that rose like ancient snow-dusted battlements around the perimeter. I had ridden past this region countless times, but had never once seen a wisp of smoke or a sign of habitation. Now I understood why. The village was completely invisible from the outside, hidden, unless you knew the precise winding path to follow through the treacherous ice-slicked canyons. "How long has your people lived here, Kiana?" I asked, my voice muffled by the thick scarf I had pulled up over my mouth and nose. The cold air burned my lungs with every breath. "3 generations, Elias," she replied, riding easily beside me, her horse navigating the slippery terrain with confident steps. "My grandfather chose this place because it has everything we need to survive. The harsh winters, warm springs, shelter from the worst winds, good hunting grounds, and most importantly, protection from those who would drive us onto the barren reservation lands." The settlement came into view abruptly, a shock of life and purposeful activity against the white and red landscape. I counted about 30 dwellings, a sturdy mixture of traditional earthen structures and more permanent timber-framed buildings adapted for prolonged cold residence. Children bundled tightly in layers of wool and hides played in a central cleared area, their laughter sharp and high on the cold air. Women worked diligently at various tasks near crackling sheltered fires. Men tended their horses in a large, well-stocked corral at the far end of the valley. What struck me most was the atmosphere. This wasn't a temporary encampment fighting for survival. It was a thriving, deeply rooted community that had learned to blend ancient tradition with practical necessity to conquer the savage winter. "Chief Chayton is waiting by the council fire," Tarek said, pointing toward a large gathering area where thick pine smoke rose in a steady cleansing column. As we approached, I saw an older man seated on a simple, low wooden chair, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. Chief Chayton appeared to be in his 60s, his silver-streaked hair contained by a simple band. His eyes, though, were what held my attention. They seemed to absorb everything without judgment, yet they missed nothing. He wore practical, heavy clothing, leather pants, a dark wool shirt, and a richly beaded vest that spoke of his position without unnecessary show. "Welcome, Elias Vance," the chief said in clear, resonant English, his voice surprisingly warm in the icy air as I dismounted. "Please sit." I took the offered seat across from the chief, painfully aware that several tribal elders and warriors had gathered at a respectful distance to observe this meeting. The cold had finally begun to settle deep into my bones, and I leaned toward the fire's welcome heat. "My daughters tell me you fought a great cat in the snow with bare hands to save them." Chief Chayton began, his eyes fixed on the bandages peeking out from beneath my torn coat. "I used a fence post initially, Chief," I clarified, my voice raspy. My hands were a last resort when the post snapped. The chief nodded, a small approving gesture. "Honesty. Good. Tell me, what do you know about the men who want your land so badly? They send their land markers in the belly of a predator, only that they've made 3 offers to buy it, each one higher than the last, with increasing urgency." I explained, gazing into the flames. When I refused the 3rd time just before the deep snow set in, their representative made it clear they wouldn't ask again. "And do you know why they want that particular piece of land, Elias?" I shook my head, shifting to ease the ache in my ribs. "It's not good cattle country. Too dry in summer, too rocky, and too exposed in winter. I've barely managed to keep a dozen head alive through this freeze." Chief Chayton leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Your land sits on the most direct practical route between their eastern holdings and the territory they intend to claim here in the canyons. Without it, they would have to travel an extra 2 days in this weather that is a death sentence for their massive herds around the frozen mesa formations." The strategic importance became crushingly clear. My small frozen ranch wasn't valuable for what it produced. It was valuable for where it Saturday. It was a toll gate. They'll take it one way or another. "Elias," the chief continued, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "Men like these, the land barons, the hired guns, do not accept obstacles. They will manufacture reasons to remove you, claim you're harboring criminals, that your animals are diseased, or that you violated some obscure territorial law they'll invent out of thin air. Then why haven't they done it already? Because taking land from a white rancher requires a flimsy justification that satisfies the territorial authorities. The chief explained the brutal honesty of his statement slicing through the air. Taking land from Apache families requires no justification at all, only the will to do it. The moral weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. I suddenly understood why Chief Chayton had been watching me, observing me through the seasons. My property was a fragile buffer zone. You could sell, the chief suggested, poking the fire gently with a stick. Take their money and start over somewhere else. Live a quiet life. I could, I agreed, staring at the embers. The thought of peace, of warmth, of not fighting the cold and the land every single day was intoxicating. But I won't. Because it's not right. And because once men like that discover they can intimidate you, they never, ever stop. Chief Chayton studied me for a long, silent moment. The scrutiny was intense. Then he stood and walked to the fire, picking up a burning stick. He began to draw lines in the packed, frozen dirt at our feet. He drew a rough, stylized map of the surrounding territory. Their land, he said, marking a large area to the east. Their intended expansion, he continued, drawing a thick arrow across the map, pointing toward the valley walls. And your land, he finished, marking a small square directly in the path of the arrow. The visual representation made the situation undeniable. My frozen, worthless ranch was the cork in a bottle these cattlemen desperately wanted to unseal. What happens if I stay and fight alone? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, feeling the despair of the isolated man I was. They will destroy you, the chief replied matter-of-factly. One man against their resources has no chance against the coming tide. The winter will not save you. The small crowd that had gathered had grown larger, and I realized every word was being listened to intently. This wasn't just a private conversation. It was a community assessment. But Chief Chayton continued, his eyes catching mine over the shimmering heat of the fire, one man fighting alongside others. That changes everything. The implication hung in the frosty air, thick and heavy as pine smoke. I realized that everything that had happened today, the attack, the rescue, even the pain in my chest, had been leading to this precise icy moment. Chief Chayton smoothed the dirt map with his heavy boot and returned to his seat. The gathered tribal members moved closer, forming a loose circle around the council fire. I sensed the formality of the next step. For 3 months, even before the snow fell, I have watched you, Elias Vance. The chief began, his voice carrying easily to everyone present. You shared your well water when the river was dry and your own beasts were starving. You helped repair the eastern fence that keeps our horses from wandering, even though you received nothing in return. You have shown respect for our boundaries and our ways. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered people. I hadn't realized how many of my solitary small acts had been observed and noted. Today you risked your life for my daughters without hesitation, without thought of reward or recognition. The chief concluded, his tone full of profound respect. You fought a predator with nothing but a broken post, courage and determination that is as hard as the winter stone. The chief stood again, walking to a wooden chest that sat near his chair. He withdrew a worn leather document case, its surface smoothed by handling. These cattlemen who threaten you also threaten us, he continued, his voice gaining depth and power. They want to drive us from this valley, to take our warm springs and our hunting grounds, to force us onto the reservation, where we would be dependent on government provisions that arrive late, often spoiled and rarely enough to survive the cold season. He opened the document case and removed several official-looking papers yellowed by time and handling. But I have something they do not expect. Legal title to this land, granted by the territorial government 15 years ago, in exchange for our service as scouts during the early conflicts. I stared at the documents. Legal land ownership by an Apache tribe was rare, almost unheard of in this territory, a territory constantly trying to deny them agency. The cattlemen assume we are squatters who can be removed at will, Elias, Chief Chayton explained. They are wrong. But legal ownership means nothing if we cannot physically defend what is ours when the time comes. Your land, though small and frozen, controls the only practical route for moving their large herds through this region. Without it, their expansion plans become much more difficult and expensive, especially with the snow this deep. What are you proposing, Chief? I asked, my voice suddenly strong, the blood surging with a new sense of purpose. An alliance, he declared. You continue to work your ranch, but under our complete collective protection. In exchange, you help us defend this valley from those who would take it. The offer was more generous than I could have dreamed. but I felt the unspoken gravity of his request. There was more. What kind of help? Chief Chayton gestured to Tarek, who stepped forward carrying a rifle, a newer, cleaner model than anything I had ever been able to afford. You can shoot Elias, the chief asked. Yes, I can, I confirmed. These cattlemen will come with armed men, hired guns who care nothing for law or justice. We need fighters who understand both Apache tactics and the white men's mindset, their movements, their vulnerabilities, their paperwork. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, faces that had watched me and judged me, and were now offering me something I had never possessed, belonging, purpose, protection. But they were also asking me to potentially fight and kill to defend it. There is something else, Chief Chayton continued, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. Something that makes this alliance even more necessary and sooner than we thought. He nodded to Laselli, who stepped forward and presented the carved bone found beneath the mountain lion. We sent riders even in this biting cold to investigate where this came from, Laselli said, her breath fogging. What they found changes everything. The cattlemen aren't just marking territory, Tarek added grimly. They are already building a permanent, heavily fortified outpost about 10 miles east of here. An armed compound, a supply depot housing for dozens of men. They are preparing for a military-style occupation of the entire region, not just a simple land grab. The implications hit me with the force of a winter gale. This was not about a few head of cattle. This was about regional dominance and ethnic cleansing. How long before they're ready to move? I asked, the cold clarity of danger sharpening my focus. 2 weeks, perhaps 3, Chief Chayton replied. They are waiting for more hired guns to arrive from Texas, and for the legal paperwork they think will give them the authority to remove us. I felt the immense weight of the decision settle on my shoulders. Accept the alliance and I would be committed to a fight that could cost me my life. Refuse and I would face the cattlemen's inevitable violence alone, watching these good people lose everything they had built. If I agree, I said slowly, meeting the chief's gaze. What exactly would be expected of me starting now? Chief Chayton smiled, a genuine warm expression that defied the cold. First, you would move your cattle here to our protected valley where they would have better water and grazing than they've had in years. That alone, he acknowledged, is worth considering. Your animals are barely surviving on your drought-stricken frozen land. My heart swelled at the thought. My poor starving animals finally having relief. Second, you would help us prepare defenses for when the cattlemen come, the chief continued. Your knowledge of their tactics, their weapons, and their movements would be invaluable. And third, his expression grew grave, you would stand with us when the fighting starts. Not as a hired gun, but as family. Family. The word struck me, a man who had known only isolation and solitude for years, with more power than any legal document or military strategy. These people were offering me not just protection, but belonging. But before I could formally respond, the drumming of frantic hooves echoed from the valley entrance. A young scout galloped in, his horse lathered with sweat despite the Arctic air, his face tight with urgency. Chief, the rider called out, dismounting quickly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Armed men are approaching Elias's ranch. At least a dozen riders heavily armed. They ride hard, unconcerned with the snow. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than anyone expected. My choice would have to be made not in the calm of the council fire, but in the white-hot immediacy of a crisis. I didn't hesitate. The choice had already been made in my heart the moment Chief Chayton said the word family. I accept your alliance, I declared, rising from my chair with renewed purpose, the pain in my chest forgotten for the moment. But we need to move now. Chief Chayton nodded, his gaze already calculating the logistics. Tarek, gather 12 of our best riders. Elias, you'll guide us to your ranch by the fastest route. They will not expect us to react this quickly to their provocation. Within minutes, the peaceful valley transformed into a controlled, disciplined whirlwind of activity. Warriors emerged from their dwellings, securing their rifles and ammunition. Horses were saddled with practiced, efficient speed. Women gathered essential supplies and prepared the community for the grim possibility that injured men would return. Kiana approached me, pressing a heavy, reliable rifle into my hands, the one Tarek had shown me earlier. This belonged to my husband, she said quietly, her eyes firm. He would want it used to protect family. The weight of the weapon was immense, both in my hand and in my soul. These people had just accepted me as one of their own, and now they were preparing to risk their lives to save my destroyed, failing ranch. The cattle, I said to Chief Chayton as we mounted our horses. Even if we drive off these men today, my animals won't survive another week on that land without water, especially with the ground frozen solid. Then we bring them back with us, the chief replied, simply adjusting his heavy, thick fur cloak against the wind. Tonight, every surviving beast is a victory against the cattlemen. As we rode out of the valley ascending the treacherous path into the open, windswept territory, I felt a strange blend of fear and ferocious anticipation. I was leaving behind the solitary life I had known for 3 brutal, isolating years, but gaining something I had never dared hope for, a place where I belonged. The frigid air seemed to invigorate me, no longer just a source of suffering, but a challenge to be met. The journey to my ranch took nearly an hour, riding hard across terrain that was now a mosaic of ice and wind-packed snow. Now I moved with a purpose I had never felt before, surrounded by skilled fighters who had chosen to stand with me against an unknown, powerful enemy. As we crested the final ridge before my property, the scene below made my blood run cold, chilling me far worse than the air. Smoke rose from multiple points around my small homestead. My barn, the one I had rebuilt twice after harsh storms, was fully engulfed in hungry flames, its skeleton collapsing into the snow. My cabin was a ruin of broken windows and a partially collapsed snow-covered roof. There, Tarek pointed, his hand gloved and steady, indicating a group of riders gathered near the wreckage of my corral. 15 men heavily armed, and they are waiting. I counted my pitiful dozen cattle scattered across the property, but only a few were moving. Most lay motionless, dark, frozen shapes in the snow. The men had killed my animals for sport, destroyed my buildings out of malice, and were now waiting to see if I would be foolish enough to return. "They want you to see this, Elias," Chief Chayton observed, his voice dark with controlled fury. "This is their message about what happens to those who refuse their offers. It is a message of ultimate disrespect." One of the raiders below had spotted our party on the ridge. Shouts, harsh, ugly sounds that defiled the silence of the winter wilderness carried across the distance as the group formed up into a defensive line. "What's the plan, Chief?" I asked, checking the action of the rifle Kiana had given me. It felt balanced, lethal, and right. Chief Chayton studied the terrain below with tactical precision. "They chose their position poorly. They have a good view of the approach, yes, but no protection from crossfire. They are focused only on the path you would naturally take." He gestured to his men, speaking rapid, clipped Apache commands. Immediately, half the warriors split off, circling wide and low to the eastern ridge, their horses moving like silent ghosts through the deep snowdrifts, while the rest prepared to advance directly. "We are not trying to kill them all, Elias," the chief explained as his horse moved forward. "We want them to deliver a message back to their employers, a message that will freeze the blood of the land barons." "What message?" I asked, clutching the reins. "That Elias Vance is no longer alone. He is family." The attack came with devastating, icy precision. As Chief Chayton's main group rode down the slope in a frontal assault, kicking up white plumes of snow, the flanking warriors opened fire from the eastern ridgeline. The cattlemen's hired guns were caught instantly between two forces, outmaneuvered and outgunned by the unexpected flanking action. The firefight lasted less than 10 terrible minutes. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly final. When the shooting stopped, 5 of the raiders lay wounded in the snow, groaning curses in the cold air, while the rest had fled, abandoning their injured companions and their equipment in their desperate scramble to escape the unexpected attack. I surveyed the wreckage of my property with a bitter mixture of devastation and fierce vindication. Everything I had built over 3 agonizing years was destroyed, reduced to smoking ruin and frozen ash. But somehow I felt more whole, more hopeful than I had in years. "Your cattle," Elias Laselli called out, riding up from the eastern pasture, her face smudged with powder, her eyes shining with adrenaline. 7 survived. The rest. She gestured toward the scattered carcasses, dark lumps against the white. 7 animals out of the dozen I had fought so hard to keep alive. It should have been devastating, but instead I felt a soaring sense of relief. 7 cattle were enough to start over, especially with the fierce, committed protection I now had. Chief Chayton approached one of the wounded raiders, a young, shivering man barely out of his teens, clutching a bullet wound in his shoulder. "Tell your employers," the chief said clearly, his voice carrying the authority of granite and iron, "that this land now belongs to the Apache Nation and Elias Vance jointly. Any further trespassing will be considered an act of war against a legally recognized entity." The wounded man nodded frantically, his eyes wide, desperate to escape with his life. "And tell them," I added, surprised by the sharp, cold authority in my own voice, "that the route through this territory is permanently closed to their operations. They will travel the long way in this weather, or they will not travel at all." As we prepared to leave with the surviving cattle, I took one last long look at the ruins of my old life. The cabin where I had lived in isolation, the barn where I had stored my meager frozen supplies, the corral where I had kept my struggling animals, all reduced to smoking embers and frozen wreckage. But as we rode back toward the Apache Valley, herding the surviving, bewildered cattle before us, I realized that Chief Chayton's decision to accept me as family had already fundamentally changed my fate. I was no longer the poor solitary rancher fighting a losing invisible battle. I was part of something larger, something resilient, something absolutely worth fighting and dying for. The Apache Valley looked entirely different when we returned long after the winter sun had dipped below the canyon walls. Where I had seen a hidden settlement before, I now saw home. The protected pastures, the warm spring-fed water, the sense of intense community. Everything my isolated ranch had lacked was here in abundance. My 7 surviving cattle, though thin and stressed from the day's trauma, immediately moved toward the valley stream where the warm spring water kept the banks clear of ice. For the first time in months, I watched my animals drink their fill without worrying about conserving every drop for the desperate tomorrow. "They will recover quickly here," Kiana observed, joining me beside the corral, a deep weariness in her eyes that spoke of the day's brutal labor now layered over the fierce joy of victory. Good grass, clean water, protection from predators and from men. And from the cold, I added, still processing the sheer, unbelievable reality of what had just happened. Chief Chayton approached, carrying the leather document case from earlier. "There is something we must discuss, Elias," he said, "the legal aspect of our alliance. The cattlemen will not stop because we defeated their hired guns today. They will bring legal challenges, claim we are harboring a criminal, petition the territorial authorities for military intervention. We must be ready for the battle in the courthouse as well." We walked to the council fire area where several tribal elders, wise and ancient men wrapped in thick furs, had gathered. I recognized the formality of the setting. This was official business, sacred business. "The cold is cruel, but the law is colder," the chief began. "We have time to prepare a proper legal defense. We have a way to protect both you and our people." He opened the document case and spread several papers, parchment yellowed and brittle with age, on a large, flat, heat-warmed stone. They were land patents, water rights, and territorial agreements, all bearing official seals and signatures from the highest authorities. "You will become a legal partner in our holdings," Chief Chayton explained, his eyes commanding attention. "Your name on these documents alongside ours. Your cattle registered as part of our operations. Your residence officially established within our protected territory." "What would that truly mean legally?" I asked. One of the elders, a man named Hakan with deeply intelligent eyes, leaned forward, his face serious. "It would mean that any attack on you becomes an attack on legally recognized Apache property. The territorial government will be required to investigate and prosecute the cattlemen, not us. You become a shield, Elias, but also a protected part of the whole." The implications were profound. Instead of being an isolated, easy target, I would become part of a powerful, legally protected community, one that the cattlemen could not simply sweep aside. "But there is more," Chief Chayton continued, reading my thoughts. "We need someone who understands both Apache and white culture to represent our interests in territorial affairs. Someone who can speak for us in courts and government offices. Someone who knows the words they use to twist the law." I stared at the chief. "You are offering me a position of authority." "We are offering you a future," Kiana said, simply standing near her father. "One where your unique knowledge and your immense courage serve a purpose larger than just mere survival in the bitter cold." Before I could respond, Laselli placed the carved bone marker on the stone beside the documents. "The scout also reported that the cattlemen have sent riders to Fort Brennan," she reported grimly. "They are claiming that Apache raiders attacked their peaceful survey team and stole cattle." The audacity of the lie should not have surprised me, but it still struck me with the force of a physical blow. These men had burned my property, killed my animals, and now they were flawlessly portraying themselves as innocent victims. "How long before soldiers arrive?" Chief Chayton asked. 2 days, maybe 3, Tarek reported. "It depends on how many men the fort commander decides to send and how much the snow has slowed their progress." The chief stood, his expression grim but absolutely determined. "Then we have time to prepare a proper legal defense and fortify our defenses. This is your final moment to choose, Elias Vance. Accept this partnership with us and help us fight this battle in courts and council chambers, or leave now before the soldiers arrive and try to start over somewhere else." I looked around the circle of faces, people who had welcomed me, protected me, and offered me a fierce, loving belonging I had never imagined possible. The choice wasn't difficult. It was simply my destiny. I accept, I said firmly, the word echoing clearly around the council fire. I accept the alliance, the partnership, and the family. But I want to understand exactly what we're fighting for, Chief. Chief Chayton smiled, a look of profound satisfaction settling on his face, and he gestured toward the valley around us. We are fighting for the right to live peacefully on land we legally own, for the right to defend ourselves against men who use violence and lies to take what they want, for the principle that justice should protect those who honor the law, not those who break it. The elder Hakan produced a pen and ink. Then we should make this official before the soldiers arrive. As I signed my new name, Elias Vance Partner, to the territorial partnership documents, I felt the weight of my decisions settle around me like a mantle of immense responsibility. 3 days ago, I had been a failing rancher with no friends, no future, and no hope, freezing to death in my own solitude. Now I was a legal partner in a thriving, resilient community, with people who considered me family and a role that gave my life meaning beyond mere survival. But as the full winter moon rose over the valley, casting long, stark shadows on the snow, I knew our greatest challenges still lay ahead. The cattlemen would not accept defeat easily, and the arrival of federal soldiers would test everything we had built. What happens when the soldiers get here, Chief Chayton? I asked, my voice low and serious. That depends entirely on whether they come seeking justice or looking for an excuse to remove us. The chief replied, his eyes narrowed, watching the dancing firelight. Either way, my son, we will be ready. Looking around at the determined, resolute faces in the firelight, I believed with all my heart that we would be. Chief Chayton's decision to accept me as family had already changed my fate beyond recognition. Now it remained to be seen whether that change would be permanent, or whether the harsh, merciless forces arrayed against us would prove too powerful to overcome. 2 days later, the muffled sound of approaching hoofbeats, slowed by the deep, freshly fallen snow, echoed from the valley entrance, announcing the arrival of the United States Cavalry. The morning the cavalry arrived, the cold was so intense, it felt as though the very air had shattered into needles of ice. I stood beside Chief Chayton, at the narrow entrance to the valley, the wind whipping the heavy buffalo hide cloak around my shoulders. The scent of pine smoke and damp wool was thick in the air, a final barrier of home against the world of brass and authority riding toward us. I could see the column clearly now, 24 mounted men led by an officer, whose uniform was startlingly clean against the endless white. The snow had slowed their advance considerably, forcing them to ride in single file, their breath exploding from the horses' nostrils in great white clouds. This wasn't a punitive expedition. This was a formal inquiry which suited our purposes perfectly. Remember your words, Elias, Chief Chayton murmured, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of all his ancestors. Do not let them turn this into a fight of guns, only a fight of documents. The officer, a stern, tightly wound man with a stiff blonde mustache, reined in his horse a respectable distance from our small delegation. He was Captain Stone, Fort Brennan's newly assigned commander, as the scout had reported. He looked utterly miserable, hating the cold, hating the territory, and hating the people who forced him to ride out in this weather. I am Captain Stone, U.S. Cavalry Commanding Post Fort Brennan, he announced, his voice clipped and strained. I am here regarding the report of an attack on property and the theft of livestock committed by Apache raiders reportedly sheltering an outlaw named Elias Vance. His gaze swept over our group, Chief Chayton, wearing his dignified best, flanked by Kiana and Laselli and Tarek, with 4 silent warriors, all of them armed but holding their rifles low, resting on the pommels of their saddles. When his eyes finally settled on me, a white man bundled in hide, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Apache chief, Captain Stone, looked momentarily shocked. I am Elias Vance, I stated, stepping forward, the wind biting at the exposed skin around my scarf. And the report you received is a malicious fabrication by the cattlemen who burned my property and murdered my livestock. I am no outlaw, Captain, but a partner in a legally recognized territorial holding. I watched the captain's face carefully. His initial assumption that he would find a hostile camp of savages and a lone, desperate fugitive was completely dismantled by my presence and my words. He frowned, his eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. You were reported to have fled after the attack, Mr. Vance, Captain Stone countered, adjusting his heavy military-issue coat. And Apache raiders are notoriously known for preying upon white settlers during the hard winter. I did not flee, Captain. I corrected, meeting his gaze steadily. I was escorted to safety and given refuge by my legal partners after the attackers, who were the cattlemen's hired guns, left me for dead. I have witnesses and I have documents. I stepped back and Kiana produced the leather document case. It was heavy, worn, and smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke. Kiana handed it to me, her hand brushing mine, a small gesture of fierce solidarity. Chief Chayton, as the leader of this community, has extended an alliance to me, I explained, pulling the yellowed papers from the case and holding them out against the wind, careful not to let the ancient documents tear. These are the land patents and territorial agreements, confirming the full legal title of this valley and surrounding land. And this document, recently witnessed and notarized, confirms my status as a legal partner in the holdings, operating my ranch from within their recognized boundaries. Captain Stone stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. He clearly hadn't expected paperwork. The cattle barons had counted on the usual unquestioning military response. Remove the indigenous people, question the white man later. These documents need verification, Mr. Vance. The captain said, his voice now slightly less certain. They could be forgeries. They are not, I insisted, keeping my voice firm and respectful, giving him no opportunity to seize control through anger. They bear the seal of the territorial governor, signed 15 years ago. Furthermore, I can provide a full itemized list of my destroyed property, my barn, my cabin, my livestock, and sign a sworn affidavit detailing the identities of the men who did it. Men who work for the very land company that filed the complaint against us. I paused, letting the silence of the cold, vast wilderness emphasize my point. You have been sent on a fool's errand, Captain. You are here to arrest a victim and harass a legally held property owner. I suggest you return to Fort Brennan and investigate the true criminals, the men who lied to the U.S. Army and committed arson and murder to acquire land they do not own. Chief Chayton finally spoke, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the rising wind. He spoke in Apache, and Tarek immediately translated his words for the captain. The chief says Tarek relayed his tone as cold and sharp as the icicles forming on the canyon walls that his people stood with the army to defend this territory in the past. Now they stand ready to defend it again, but this time from men like your informant. You may enter our valley to verify the health and status of Mr. Vance's remaining 7 cattle, as they are now legally registered under our care. But you will not draw a single weapon, nor will you interfere with our community. Captain Stone was trapped. He was a man of the law, however, flawed that law might be. Faced with a white, educated American citizen presenting legally valid papers and lodging a formal complaint of felony arson and murder, he could not simply charge in and start a fight, especially not in this blizzard-like cold. The consequences back at the territorial capital would destroy his career. He looked at the determined faces of the Apache warriors, the steadfast gaze of Chief Chayton, and the unwavering conviction in my own eyes. He knew he had been deliberately misled by the cattlemen. Very well, Mr. Vance, Captain Stone conceded stiffly. I will take these documents and this affidavit back to the fort. We will verify their authenticity with the territorial government. Until that time, I cannot and will not make any arrests or interfere with your operations here. He gestured to one of his men. Sergeant, accept the documents. We ride out immediately. The confrontation had ended not with the blast of rifles, but with the quiet rustle of paper. As the cavalry turned and retreated, their columns slowly disappearing back into the swirling snow, I felt the tension drain out of me, leaving me weak and profoundly relieved. We had won the first and most crucial legal battle. Chief Chayton placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder, the warmth of his hand penetrating the thick hide of my coat. Well done, my son, he said, a genuine smile lighting his face. You fought their law with their own words. That is a great victory. I looked back into the protected valley, seeing the plume of smoke rising from the council fire and the small, sturdy cluster of buildings that was now my home. My 7 surviving cattle were slowly regaining their strength beside the thermal stream. I was injured, my property was ruined, and the true threat of the land barons still loomed. But I was no longer alone, and I was no longer just a failing rancher. I was a partner, a protector, and part of a family. That night, as the cold deepened, wrapping the valley in a pristine, silent blanket of snow, I sat with Kiana and Liseli by the newly restored corral where my cattle were safely housed. The stars above were brilliant and impossibly cold, but the air around the small spring-fed stream was warm and comforting. The chief says you will begin working on the correspondence to the territorial governor tomorrow, Kiana said her voice soft in the quiet night. You must outline the cattlemen's crimes in detail and demand reparations for the animals they murdered and the property they burned. I'll need every detail about their outpost Tarek's scout reports and everything you know about their leaders, I replied, feeling the familiar steady pressure of work settling over me. It was a good pressure, a purposeful pressure. Laselli, sitting cross-legged near a small fire, looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the dancing flame. The hardest fight is over, Elias. The fight for your heart. You chose us. The rest is just a matter of time and strategy. I smiled, feeling a peace I hadn't known existed. I reached out and touched the bandage on my chest. The mountain lion's claws had left 3 deep scars, symbols of a life I had left behind, but they were also the marks of my acceptance, the prophecy Kiana had spoken of, and the sign of the fierce, enduring allegiance I had found in the bitter cold. The winter still had months left to run, and the cattle barons would surely return with renewed rage, but let them come. Elias Vance, the solitary rancher, was gone. In his place stood a man who had found his purpose and his people. I was ready for whatever the merciless winter or the cruel world chose to send my way. I was home. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.